We've had an overwhelming response to this webinar, which clearly reflects the relevance and the level of interest in this particular topic of Asian cultural literacy. It's great to have you on board in this next hour. My name is Hiro Tajima, and I'm a Senior Manager, Regional Development Asia Pacific at Wine Australia. The importance of the Chinese and other Asian markets obviously rising, it is imperative that Australian wine exporters are equipped with a practical knowledge of the cultural differences. To be successful, we need to be aware of and ideally well-versed in what to expect when doing business in Asia and how not to get lost in translation. Initiated as part of the $50 million export and regional wine support package, today's webinar is part one of the two-part presentation touching on this very topic. As today's speaker, I am pleased to introduce Jin Cao, Director of Chinese Language and Cultural Advice, also known as CLCA. Established in 1998 in Adelaide, CLCA is a key provider of professional training, project management, business intelligence, and language support services. Originally from Shanghai, Jin has a background in business management, and his main role is training development and delivery. Jin has worked with some of the most iconic names in wine, such as Jacob's Creek, Penfolds, Peter Lehmann, Seppeltsfield, as well as small and medium-sized wineries, mostly here in South Australia. His insights into the Chinese and Asian culture are an invaluable asset to Australian wine exporters, and we look forward to his presentation. Today, we will focus on the basics to get you started on the Asian cultural journey. With those visiting Hong Kong and China next month in mind, Jin will give you an overview on the fundamental differences between the West and the East, then take you through the key points of what to do before the trip, during the trip, and how to follow up after the trip. Before I bring Jin in, I would like to mention a few things. After the webinar, we will make a synopsis of today's presentation available for your reference. To download the synopsis, you will have to complete a very short survey to obtain the download link. The survey is designed to gather your feedback and to ensure workshops in May address your key questions and deliver valuable insights to support your export success. We will send you a link to the online survey shortly. Speaking of questions, you would have noticed that there is a live Q&A function on your screen. You are welcome to send in questions. Time permitting, we'll endeavor to address your questions. However, please do understand that we may not be able to touch on all your questions, which may be another reason for you to consider attending the workshop in May. Well, I've spoken enough. Without further ado, please welcome Jin Cao.
Thank you, Hiro. Thank you, Wine Australia, for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So cultural lesson number one, patience is a virtue, right? So I would like to begin my talk by quoting from Peter Drucker, who is a very famous American author. He once said that the only thing we know about the future is that it will be different. For many exporters, China and Asia Pacific represent a great opportunity right on our doorstep. I think it's safe to say that China, for many of us, is the future. The thing, though, is China and the rest of Asia are experiencing huge social and economic transformation as we speak. No matter how many times you have been there, there's always something new to experience, something new to learn. And let's face it, Asia is so big that no one truly understands everything about it. So I want you to understand that when you go over there, you need to have an open mindset that acknowledge that everything you have read up to this point may become irrelevant the moment you land over there. A quick example. Many of you probably have heard of this term called tiered cities in China. So we have tier 1, tier 3, etc., etc. Now, according to a lot of research, Wine Australia included, that there are huge differences in terms of wine consumption, repertoire, behavior between the higher tier and the lower tier cities. But a lot of the so-called lower tier cities are actually fast becoming higher tier cities as we speak. So there's always something new to learn. Today, I'm going to be focusing on some of the key cultural differences and give you some of the tips to prepare you for the trip. Understanding the fundamental differences between the East and the West will help you navigate the cultural minefield. Some of the key differences I'm going to address are relationships, hierarchy, and thought process. So here I have the word for relationships in Chinese, which is called 关系. Many of you probably have heard of that term. We can all agree that relationships are absolutely critical in business success. However, some cultures in the East require a lot more personal input when building relationships. So let's do a comparison here. So on the left side of the slide, you'll see a typical Aussie male, Chris Hemsworth, and on the right side, you'll see a typically good-looking Chinese male, aka me. I know probably you have thrown up in your mouth a little bit, but it's okay. Now, Australians tend to build purpose-driven relationships, which is often based on the business titles and the job descriptions. The style of communication in Australia is usually quite direct and precise. And in such purpose-driven relationships, people tend to separate business agenda from their personal feelings. However, in China, Chinese people tend to build personal relationships with others, which is often based on the personal network rather than the job description. During the Chinese-style business relationship building stage, people tend to give each other face. So when we say face giving, we're talking about understanding and acknowledging each other's social status. And during that stage, we allow a lot of ambiguity to build harmony. Knowing this, when you go to Asia Pacific, you need to develop certain skills so that you can understand what you're dealing. If you're an Australian, you probably need to spend a little bit more time understanding people's background before you address the issue. Going straight to the point may be seen as immature or even short-sighted by Asian standards. So you really need to develop a lot more personal network. And when you're there, try to go with the flow to give face to the host. As a Chinese person, on the other hand, Chinese people really need to learn how to be more task-driven and transparent in relationship building. And this is where you can actually help your Chinese counterpart by bridging such cultural gap. So when you deal with Chinese counterpart, it's a good idea to explain to them that being task-driven and transparent is not really rude or invasive in Australia. So that is the first difference. The second key cultural difference is the concept of hierarchy. In Australia, we have 24 million people, and the working population is around about 12 to 13 million people. China, on the other hand, has got more than 1.3 billion people. The working population is close to 900 million. Okay, so there's a big difference in the population. So what that means is that there are a lot more hierarchies in China. So if we do a comparison here, Australian businesses, especially in the wine industry, are relatively small and flat hierarchy. So people are what we call egalitarian driven. Okay, so very low power distance. In the small wine businesses, people are often multitasking. Okay, so a trade manager sometimes have to deal with some marketing inquiries, for example. So in the Australian environment, people are taught to be result driven and not necessarily based on their experience. Sometimes we even, in Australia, we make fun that being old is not necessarily an asset. It might be a liability. In China, well, because of the population, we have more layers. We have more business units. So they're a lot more hierarchical, process-driven. And what that means is that people at the lower level in the hierarchy, they may not be required to multitask. So they do one thing and one thing only. Now, what that means is people in the Chinese organization at the lower level, they can become quite parochial. In other words, pretty narrow-minded, narrow outlook when it comes to their work, because they don't really need to multitask. So now knowing this, when you deal with Chinese people, as an Australian, you need to verbally respect the age and experience of the counterpart. And you also need to invest a lot more time in building your personal network. Because once you have the network, have your relationships, it will give you the access into the higher rankings in the Chinese organization. You really need that personal introduction. As a Chinese person, Chinese person actually need to understand that they need to build personal accountability rather than solely relying on their hierarchy to solve issues. And this is once again where you can come in and help them understand how to do business in Australia. You can help them understand that they need to develop their skills and confidence in handling complex tasks and how to take initiatives in delivering results. So that's the hierarchy. The third and critical between the East and West is the concept of time. Now, if I ask you to draw a car on a sheet of paper, you can do that, no doubt. But if I ask you to draw the time on a piece of paper, what does it look like? A very famous Japanese author once said that time isn't really a straight line. It doesn't even have a shape. But since we can't picture something without form in our minds, for the sake of convenience, we just understand time as a straight line. So that's a very valuable lesson. Not everyone sees time as a straight line. And that has a lot to do with the thought process. As an Australian, very linear thinking people, you tend to often develop a set of rules and standards and use a lot of tools to stay focused and to stay organized. Australians tend to make a plan for things and to solve a problem, which often involves a step-by-step progression. Chinese and many Asian people, however, are not necessarily linear thinkers. They don't see time as a straight line. In fact, Chinese and many Asian people think that things can expand in multiple directions. So what happens is that Chinese people can be very impulsive and situational when they deal with certain tasks. And often, in order to avoid embarrassment, they can become very indirect, withdrawn, and sometimes even evasive. So you've got to keep that in mind. So when dealing with Chinese people, as an Australian, you need to really dig into the underlying assumptions of people. Now, what that means is you need to understand the motivations of the other side. Why do they want to do business with you? Because once you understand the motivations, that will help you understand their behavior. Equally important, you need to confirm affiliation. Now, what that means is, as a linear thinker, a problem solver, quite often you email the Chinese side asking for some answers or addressing some issues. But if you continue to do that, Chinese will actually start thinking, gee, you are so negative, because every time you email me, there's a problem you want me to solve. So that actually can have a very damaging effect on the relationship. So every time you want to address some issue, you need to confirm that this is a very important relationship for both sides. That's why you want to bring it to the surface. So you need to confirm affiliation. You can also help the Chinese to understand that going straight to the point is not necessarily a bad thing in Australian corporate culture. And you can also help the Chinese understand the Australian business environment and regulatory environment so they understand how you do things in Australian context. So these are some of the fundamental differences between the East and the West. The next thing we're going to talk about is what are the things you need to do before, during, and after the trip to China and also Asia. With each topic, I've developed 5 tips. So altogether, you're going to have 15 tips. So once you understand these 15 tips, I can guarantee your trip will be a wonderful experience. So let's talk about pre-trip. So before going to a trade show in Asia, you've got to do 5 things right. Okay, I'm going to give you these 5 tips and we're going to explain them in more details. First, you've got to have marketing materials translated into the target language, in this case, Chinese. You have to have a set of proper business cards translated into the target language. You have to set up a social media account. You also have to think of some proper gifts for the key contacts. And finally, you've got to be digital ready. So have the apps and power bank. Now, with the last tip, apps, what I mean is that there are a lot of useful apps you can download to your smartphone. For example, there's an app called iTranslate Voice, which allows you to translate from English to any languages, okay, verbally. So if you're looking for a toilet or an ATM, that app will really solve those issues for you. A power bank is super useful because you'll be on your phone the whole day. All right, so that's pretty visual. I'm going to explain in more details the first 4 points. Okay, so I'm going to use the next few slides to explain here. So let's talk about marketing material in both English and Chinese. So chances are you don't speak Chinese and you have to get someone to translate materials into Chinese for you. So you still have more than a month to plan this. So my tips when it comes to effective translation, I've got 3 pieces of advice for you. First thing you need to focus when you have marketing material developed for the Asian market is you need to focus on authenticity. Now, what that means is there was a report back in 2016 suggesting that a lot of the Chinese consumers of imported wine worry that the wines they're drinking are fake. So in your marketing collateral, before you start talking about your products, well, I would like you to spend a bit more time explaining that you are a real business, that you are real, not a contrived fake business just set up for one show. So you need to convince the consumers that this is a real business. Okay, so authenticity, you need to explain that where you're located and the story of your brand. You also need to keep consistency. Now, I've been in the translation industry for more than 15 years. One of the biggest issues I find is that businesses over the time use different translators to translate different things. So you get someone to do the website, you get someone to do the tasting notes, someone to do the business cards. The issue it creates is that the names of brands and regions and varieties, you end up with so many different Chinese names for them. Okay, so that is really confusing for the readers. My advice, if you're going to translate the regions and varieties into Chinese, is stick with the One Australia's translation. So if you can tell the translator, whoever you're using, is have a look at One Australia's Chinese website and the WeChat account. There are already a lot of the materials translated into Chinese. So stick with those official names. So that will keep the consistency going, which is absolutely crucial. Thirdly, do not use Google Translate. Google Translate has its limits. It's not sophisticated enough. For example, if you use Google Translate to translate words like sparkling wine, chances are you're going to end up with bling bling wines in Chinese. So that is not good for your brand. So still keep professional translators in the loop, use their service rather than using machine translation. And the same rule applies with business cards. So here I have an example of my own business card, very old card. I used it 10 years ago. I'm no longer using it. So I'm just using it here as an example to show you the importance of business cards. Now, business cards, as many of you probably already know, are essential in doing business in Asia. It is an extension of your identity. So you never go to a meeting without a business card. But often people ask, what should I translate on the card? Well, the first piece of advice is you don't have to translate everything. A lot of the things are not translatable. For example, the address. You can't translate address into Chinese or any languages. Logo, for example, because they're trademarked, so they don't really need translation. The most critical piece on the card is your title. Your title determines your position in the pecking order. So having the right title is really important. So here I've got some examples of some of the commonly used titles in English and their Chinese equivalent. As Hero said earlier today, that the synopsis will be made available. So once you have that synopsis available in front of you, those words are there for you to view. So the titles are absolutely critical to get them right. Often people ask, what about my name? Should I translate my name into Chinese or any Asian languages? My advice is, if you're only going to Asia maybe once or twice a year, you probably don't need a Chinese name or any Asian names. I think it's just not necessary. You can still keep your English name, but as I said, your title is the most crucial part on the business card. The other thing you've got to consider is social media account. Now, in China, people use this app called WeChat. In other Asian markets, they probably use some of the standard Western apps like Facebook or WhatsApp. WeChat is unique to China. It's got over 1 billion active accounts by far, so it's the most used for app in Asia Pacific. So WeChat, just to give you a bit of background, WeChat is the most popular instant messaging app. It's also a digital wallet in China. Now, for you going to Asia, going to China, Hong Kong, you won't be able to use the digital wallet function because you don't have a Chinese bank card. But it's a very useful tool in instant messaging. So my advice is you download this app to your phone and also your PC. It's got a PC version. And you set up your own personal account. Now, WeChat has actually got several different types of accounts you can select. My advice is to set up your personal account. So you as the user, and when you set it up, use your real name as the account name, okay? Because it is a business tool. Think of it as kind of like your LinkedIn page. So it has to be done properly from the start. So you set up using your real name rather than a corny name like Top Gun 1986, which by the way is a great film to watch. So you set up your real name, and also if you're smart enough, maybe add your winery name next to it so people can distinguish you from any other accounts they link with. So set it up. Now I'll give you some examples of how I use my WeChat, and perhaps you will find it really useful. So on my phone, I've got a few images to show you. I use WeChat as a replacement of emails. So I don't really send emails to my Chinese clients or contacts anymore. Every file I send to my clients are done on WeChat. So it's a very useful tool in a business sense. If you're a small winery, as I said earlier, that you need to convince people you are a real business. So the quickest and easiest way to do that is to post some of the images and videos on your own personal account. Especially the vintage season, you can actually post some images on your own account and share it with your contacts. That actually convinces people that you are a real, authentic business in Australia. So that is really useful in branding. If you're looking after Chinese delegations, let's say you're hosting some traders from China, you can also take some photos or some quick videos and share it on your moments. So that is a great way to build personal relationships. So it's a really useful app. I highly recommend you download it to your phone, called WeChat. And then you need to think about gifts. Now, you don't have to buy gifts for everybody, okay? You're not Santa Claus. This is not a Christmas trip. You buy gifts for those who are really important to you as a token of personal appreciation. Some of the simple rules when it comes to gifts. In Asian languages, okay, there's a concept called homophones. Homophone means different words with the same pronunciation. Okay, so different words, but they all sound exactly the same. In Asian culture, you've got to be really careful with homophones because a lot of the words can carry bad meanings. Simply the pronunciation reminds people of something they don't like. In Chinese culture, because I'm Chinese, so I use our culture as an example, the kind of things you need to avoid, okay, you need to stay away from are clocks, umbrellas, shoes, mirrors, and hats. Okay, so these things remind people of some bad words. So stay away from homophones. So if you're not too sure, you can always ask another Asian person to say whether this is good or bad. In my opinion, there's not really a thing called perfect gift because we are all different individuals. In my experience, a good gift is usually something displayable. So you can actually put it on your desk or put it on a coffee table. And it's something that people can actually use in their daily lives. So that maximizes the relationship building. One thing you've got to be careful is that gift giving is a ceremony. Okay, it's not a casual thing you do. It's just like a business card exchange. You've got to do it with both hands. So when you give someone a gift, it needs to be done in a very formal way. So use two hands, and very importantly, you need to prepare a little speech. So a little speech that explains why this is a very important relationship to you, and why you picked this particular item to the receiver, why you think they were going to like it. So just a little speech that gives face to the other side. So these are the 5 tips I've got for you just before you leave Australia for China and also Hong Kong. When you are over there, okay, during the trip, I would like to share 5 tips with you so that you make the most out of the trip. You need to dress up properly for your brand. You need to understand the concept of personal space. How do you work with an interpreter? How to avoid getting lost in translation? And finally, what are the dining etiquettes? Okay, so let's start from the top one. Dress appropriately. Now, many Asian people may not be experts in wine, but they know a lot about brands. Okay, Asian people are brand conscious. We know when we talk about like premium luxury or accessible everyday luxury, we know those brands really well. To us, wine is a brand. So if you're promoting premium wine brands, you need to dress like you belong in that social club. Okay, so you got to really look the part if you're promoting a premium product. So you cannot think like a farmer, you need to think like a fashion designer. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I think it's really important that you dress up appropriately. If you don't know who you're going to meet, always dress up. Okay, always dress up. Let's talk about the next thing, personal space. Now, I've got a few images to show you. This is a photo taken by a very famous French photographer living in Hong Kong. If you look at Asia Pacific, China, for example, okay, China accounts for more than 1/5 of the top 30 mega cities in the world. Okay, mega city means a city with more than 10 million people. And in fact, 6 out of the top 10 mega cities are in Asia. Okay, so we have a massive population. As an Australian, when you go to a networking event, now you may not realize this yourself, but subconsciously, for example, when you meet someone new, you won't stay within a meter. Okay, so a meter is usually separate from a social relationship from a personal relationship. So you keep your distance from the next person. If you know that person, you stay within a meter, but you will keep at least half a meter from that person. Okay, you don't enter that half a meter unless you have a really intimate relationship. So this is the Australian way. I want you to completely forget about this because in Asia, this type of personal space model simply doesn't work. Okay, we got so many people. So don't be intimidated if someone stands within half a meter with you. Okay, it's not because they are intimate. It's just purely because we've got so many people. So you just have to stand closely to the next person. Okay, so don't take it personally. It's not really about invasion of personal space. Now, chances are you're not a bilingual person. So you're going to these wine shows using a translator or technically interpreter to help you get your message across. When you work with an interpreter, now, first of all, there are 2 types of people who are going to translate for you. First type is your own contacts and your own business partners who are bilingual. So those are actually involved in the actual business. The interpreters I'm referring to here are those people who are paid by the hour or by the day to translate. So those are the professional translators, interpreters, who will send you the bill at the end of the day for the service. So when you work with those people who are professional translators, interpreters, there are certain rules you need to understand. Now, every industry has a code of ethics, and the same rule goes with interpreters and translators. Now, this is the Australian standard code of ethics. Okay, in the highlighted box, I want you to have a look at the final sentence. Okay, the final sentence in that highlighted box. It says, translators or interpreters do not allow bias to influence their performance. They do not soften, strengthen, or alter the messages being conveyed. So what that means is those professional interpreters translate things as they are said. So if you're using those interpreters, now if you're going to impress a very important client, I want you to remember that it is your job to impress the clients, not the interpreter's job to impress. Okay, you are responsible for your own words. So you need to think of the nice things to say. Okay, rather than telling the interpreter, make sure you say something nice. It's not their job, it's your job. But what's important, and I'd like you to do during the trip, is at the end of each day, have a few minutes with these professional interpreters, have a debrief, and get their opinion, because quite often they can share a lot of their feedback with you at the end of the gig. So it's really useful to hear from their own experience that how the meeting goes. That would be very useful. And if you don't speak Chinese, chances are you're going to get lost in translation. And I'm sure it happens to a lot of you that you say something and the other person just looked really confused. So how do you how do you avoid loss in translation? Well, there's a concept in language called morpheme. And I don't expect you to understand how morpheme works. Morpheme basically means the meaning of every word. Okay, so the meaning of every single word. Now, if you're speaking your own native language, you don't necessarily think about every word, like what does it actually mean? Let me give an example. I was at the airport recently, so I was watching a conversation between a Chinese tourist and an airport volunteer worker. So in that particular instance, the Chinese tourist was asking for direction to the toilet. The volunteer worker said this. She said, "Head down that way." Now, as an English speaker, you know what that means. It means just follow that direction. What actually happened was the Chinese tourists, hearing that feedback, stood there and looked down, stared at the floor for a few seconds, because she really took it quite literally, like put the head down. So when you talk to someone who don't speak English as a native language, their way of processing the information is to try to understand the meaning of every single word you say. This is where lost in translation happens. Another quick example. Now, quite often, I'm sure you would have done this in your own life. When someone says something that is really dumb, your feedback would be something like, "Oh, that's interesting," with a pause, right? You don't want to hurt their feelings, so you say, "Oh, that's interesting. Thanks for telling me." Now, when you say "very interesting" to an Asian person who speaks English as a second language, they'll take it quite literally. They will think, "Gee, you really like my idea. You really love what I just said." So lost in translation happens. Similarly, an Australian person quite often will say, "Oh, by the way," now what that means in Australia is the next thing I'm going to say is really important. You better remember it. But from a Chinese person's view, by the way, it sounds like it's not really that important. So when someone says, "by the way," to me, my subconscious mind tells me, "Oh, I can just forget it," because it's not important. So when you speak to someone who don't speak English as the native language, I want you to think about every single word you say. Does it actually translate? Does it have a precise meaning? So my tip when you deal with Asian people is the way you say things needs to be actually direct, straight to the point, be precise, but make sure you say it with a very friendly tone in your voice. And make sure you have open body language and remain eye contact and acknowledge the other person's status by using the proper titles. But the actual words you say needs to be direct and precise. And don't use those feeling words like "very interesting." That will actually confuse a lot of people. Here I have a Chinese word that means harmony. Now, as we all know, harmony is important. What does the word harmony actually mean in China? Well, in Chinese, the word harmony literally means put food in the mouth. Okay, the left side of the word means food, the right side of the word means mouth. So eating creates harmony. Now, eating is a very complex process, and if you master it well, it will lead you to a lot of business success. So dining etiquette is important. But when we say dining etiquette in the Asian context, we are not talking about the kind of food or where do you put the knife and fork. Dining etiquette in Asian context is about knowing who's whom on the table and knowing the order of things. So dining is about showing respect to the hierarchy. For example, when you go to Hong Kong and China, you are a guest. As a guest, you will be escorted to your seat at a dinner. Okay, so the host will actually arrange the seating positions. You need to follow their instructions rather than just grabbing a seat. And also, you cannot be late for those events. Okay, never be late for those functions. The reason being that a lot of the important information is exchanged right at the beginning of meals. For example, introduction, who's whom, and some of the latest development in the industry. Those words are usually exchanged in the first 5 to 10 minutes. So if you miss the first 10 minutes, you missed out on a lot of the critical information. So don't be late. Always show up on time. The third thing is, when it comes to dining and drinking, Australians often drink alcohol simply because they are thirsty. Chinese people drink alcohol because we want to toast to somebody. So it's a group thing. So never drink alone by yourself. That's bad. You always raise the glass because you want to toast to somebody. So you always have to think of the speech, the titles, every time you raise the one glass. So keep that in mind. Never drink alone. Finally, after a wonderful trip to the region, you come back to Australia. What do you need to do to make the most out of the trip? So the third and final topic is, how do you follow up with potential customers? Well, one of the things you can do is use a tool called Eisenhower Decision Matrix. Now, what does that actually mean? For example, I'm pretty bad at names and cards. So I often meet a lot of people, and at the end of the day, I struggle to remember who's whom. So I use this tool to just try to prioritize the context. Now, what's the matrix? What does it look like? It's actually really simple. Eisenhower was the 34th US president, and he once said that what's important is not necessarily urgent, and what's urgent is not necessarily important. So this matrix was developed just to separate things from each other. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 different categories. So in the first quadrant, you have things that are important and urgent. And then you have things that are important but not urgent. And you have things that are not important but pretty urgent, and then neither important nor urgent. And this actually can be very useful if you have 100 Chinese business cards or WeChat accounts in front of you. You're trying to think, gee, what do I do with these people? So you put all the cards, you assort them into these 4 different quadrants. For example, those who are really important people, important and urgent, you put them in the first category, and you come up with some nice emails to send them straight away. If those people you meet are not important or urgent at all, you probably will delegate the task to somebody else to look after them. So, but you need to set up a system just like that so you can prioritize your contacts. Otherwise, if you get 300 cards, you spend equal amount of time on all these 300 people, it's actually wasting a lot of your own time. So that is how I prioritize my contacts, and I think you can do similar things as well. When you finish the trip, you need to keep the conversation happening. Now, as I said earlier, dealing with Asian people is like building your own personal network, and that's an ongoing process. Okay, it's an ongoing process. So what that means is, once you come back to Australia, you need to keep the conversation happening. Now, you can either do that via emails or WeChat or some other social media apps, but you need to keep talking to these people. Now, my way of initiating that conversation is I would send them some of the photos I take during the trip. Photos of food, of buildings, of the great moments we share during the trip. So that is a great conversation starter. So I share a lot of photos. Also, when someone in Hong Kong and China introduces you to somebody new, and when you want to send the new person an email, an introduction, I would say you include those facilitators in those chain of emails, because it's a network you're building. Okay, it's not one person to one person, it's a group of people sharing information. So keep everybody in the loop, in the chain. That is very important. When you send something to China, you've got to be aware of the firewall of China. Now, most Asian countries use the common social media apps and websites like YouTube or WhatsApp. China is a little bit different. China has its own digital landscape. Most of the Western apps and websites are blocked in China. So you've got to keep that in mind. For example, if you've got a YouTube video, you can't just send a Chinese person the link to the video. Okay, you have to actually use a Chinese video sharing platform called Youku. Similarly, if you send something via Dropbox, Dropbox is not available, so you need something else. For example, Baidu Cloud. So China has its own social media apps and websites. Now, in this synopsis, you will have a list of all those Chinese apps and websites, so you can have a look and investigate. But keep that in mind. You can't just simply send a link over to China and expect people to be able to open that link. If you're dealing with Hong Kong, you don't really have that kind of issues. Point number 4, you need to share your experience with all your colleagues back in Australia. Okay, now many small wineries, they usually just have 1 or 2 people to look after the China or Asia Pacific market. It's really important that you share such information with other colleagues in the workplace because they need to understand what it takes to do business in Asia, in China. What if you go on a holiday? And it happens a lot of times when someone goes on a holiday for 3 weeks, then all the trade stops with China because only that person knows what the Chinese people want. So you really need to set up this internal discussion mechanism so information is constantly shared with all the other colleagues. And if you have been dealing with Chinese people for a while, you probably agree that the Chinese people do business 24/7. Okay, so if you're dealing with Chinese people, it's not a 9 to 5 job. It's a 5 to 9 job. And it's a 24/7 job even. So you really need to delegate a lot of the tasks to all the other colleagues. Otherwise, you just spend all of the time answering those inquiries. So that is very important. Finally, let's say you receive an inquiry via email, an email coming from China saying, hi, we are interested in your wines. I would like to talk about importing your products. And you think that's a pretty legit inquiry and it comes from a very legit corporate email address. You think, gee, I really want to find out a little bit more about this particular business. Who can I ask? Well, if that inquiry comes from China, there is help available. Okay, there is a system which is very, very catchy in the name. It's called the National Enterprise Credit Information Publicity System. What is that? That is actually a website. A website that looks like that. A website that is developed by the Chinese State Administration for Industry and Commerce. So every business in China will have the data available on this website. It's basically an online database, so you can actually type the name of the business into that box and it will give you a bit more details of this particular business. For example, it will tell you the registered capital and which year was it established, and also what industry are they allowed to operate in. So it does give you a little bit of background of the business. And also, very crucially, if that particular business has been red flagged by the Chinese authorities, for example, maybe there's a tax issue or there's some problem, inconsistency with their annual report, then the government, this online database will actually show you that warning. Okay, so it is actually quite a useful tool if you want to have some leverage in negotiation. The issue is that this online portal is in Chinese language only. It doesn't have an English version. Okay, so unfortunately, you have to rely on a Chinese person to help you research this database. So that is the limits of it. But at least there are actually systems like this available if you want to find out a little bit more about the Chinese business that just emailed you. So these are the 15 tips. So I hope that you have got a bit of understanding of what you need to do before, during, and after the trip. I would like to conclude that the future is really unclear. It's always evolving and changing. The best way to predict the future is to create it. So I want to congratulate all of you who are embarking on the journey to Hong Kong and China very soon. When you're over there, mingle with the locals, try the local food, and I recommend that you visit the local liquor stores and talk to the shoppers over there. That will give you a good idea of the market that you're dealing with. So thank you for your patience, and once again, apologies for the delay at the start. I hope you got the most out of it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jin, for a very informative and engaging presentation. I just always love your presentation and seeing and hearing your passion and also expertise in this topic. As for the Q&A that came in live, I believe that there is just one question which pertained to the difference in the cultures of Malaysia and Thailand, which in itself is a quite deep topic. And so we will try to address that in the May workshop in a way that Chinese people and Chinese culture in those markets and affecting those cultures, because it's very important in the business in those markets.
Yes, and I would also like to add something to that, is that when we talk about cultural awareness, the issue with cultural awareness training is that it only deals with the concept. Okay, the concept is there, but when you actually go there, you actually experience it in context. So cultural awareness is important, but ultimately what it actually is required to develop is a set of skills to understand the motivations of people. Okay, so when you're over in Thailand, in Malaysia, you see a lot of things. You see how people dress, you see how people drink. But what you need to start developing is a set of questions you ask those people over there to say, why do you want to buy our wine? Okay, what is the motivation behind doing business with us? So only when you understand the motivations, which is the core piece, then you actually have a better understanding of the behaviors of individuals.
As a matter of fact, today's presentation is called China and Asia Ready Workshop and Webinar. We definitely focus more on the Chinese culture. But for example, between Jin and myself, who's Japanese, there's a lot in common. And there are some subtle differences, which makes it really interesting. But as Asians, we have a lot in common.
I think so. I think as an Asian person, we just always want to know who we're dealing with. And I think so you really need to build up personal trust and personal networks. I think that's the most important message here.
That's right. There's another question with regard to how to source interpreters in China, I believe is in relation to the China Roadshow. I will leave that one to the China Roadshow team back in Sydney, and we'll make sure that they'll provide you with the information that you require in order to source interpreters. So all in all, I believe that some of the 15 points that Jin has shared with all of you, they may come as sort of natural, and some of the points may go like, wow, you know, they're quite different, and it does require some more thoughts. We will be providing you with a synopsis, and it's quite detailed and very useful, I'm sure, synopsis that you can keep referring back to. And as Jin said at the end, it is really not by textbook, but through the experience and the openness and your common sense and a sense as a person, which really opened door to us having success in Asian business. And I think that with that kind of attitude and openness, you get to enjoy this Asian business. So with that, we like to, oh, sorry. Okay, so another question is whether interpreters are crucial in Hong Kong. I would probably answer that question. So Hong Kong as a place is very much English speaking, particularly within the wine world. But the reality is that Vinexpo presence for Wine Australia and Australian wine, we do attract a lot of Chinese people, Chinese wine buyers and wine professionals from the mainland who may not always speak great English. So having interpreters does help, but it really depends. So some booths, they equip themselves with some interpreters, and some people try to speak slowly and plainly and try to establish communication that way, which is actually quite good because While the English for them, for the Chinese visitors to China, to Hong Kong may be limited, but if you embrace that limitation and try to make effort mutually, that would actually help create a relationship. And I'm trying to see if there is one more question. Please provide some key points for cellar doors in Australia to become ready for China and Asia visitors.
Wow, that itself is a 4-hour workshop, I think. I think to narrow it down, I think it's not really about one set of rules, because at the end of the day, we're different individuals wanting different experiences. But what I like to highlight here is that you need to create authenticity in your cellar door experience, that this is a real place with real experience. And also you need to have the right definition of your winery. And this is absolutely crucial because Asia market is so competitive. If you just go there and say, we are a cellar door located 40 minutes out of Adelaide or somewhere, Hunter Valley, it doesn't really stand out from all the other noises. So you really need to find a clever way to define your experience and in a way that is translatable to the Asian market.
Great. Well, for the sake of time, we might wrap up, but as you must be aware, this is only the beginning of a 2-part series. You'll get to dig in even more deeply into the world of what makes China and Asia unique. So we hope to have you join our 4-hour workshop in Adelaide on the 1st of May, or in Melbourne on the 3rd of May. For more information on these workshops and to register, please visit www.wineaustralia.com under China Market Programs. For those outside South Australia and Victoria, we will be live recording the workshop and later sharing the video link with you. As I said before, we ask you to please complete the online survey when it comes to your inbox. We thank you in advance for your inputs to make the May workshop the relevant presentation meeting your needs. Once again, thank you for joining the China Asia Ready webinar, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.